and Anna Maria, a lot of people talk about the benefits of a raw food diet. What you particularly do that's different than almost every other whole food plant-based person, virtually every one, is you, in addition to saying what they say, you then say at the end, and fruit, because it's picked unripe and because it's been hybridized, is something we should only have 15% of by weight in our diet. And then when you are asked about it, to elaborate, Brian, you seem to take almost a negative view of fruit completely, where it seems like some people would say, well, moderate amounts of berries or moderate amounts, but I'm not sure I'm interpreting right, but it almost seems like you're saying that because the fruit's been hybridized, we should not even have it. And I know that, I hear all the other Joel Fuhrman, Brenda Davis, all the other whole food plant-based people, they say there's lots and lots of studies about the benefits of fruits, and is it possible you're taking too strong a position on it? I mean, why isn't anyone else feeling that fruit in sugar intact in a berry is okay, and you're feeling so strong? So could you clarify how strong do you feel about the fruit, and where what's the reason the other people are not coming to this conclusion?
We sit in a very unique position than probably everyone else you've talked about. The sickest people in the world come to us. So after they've gone to the alternative doctor, they've been to the hospitals, many of these people are told they're giving up, then they show up at Epocrates. And we have the great gift of working with these people and observing what is working for them and what's not working for them. Now, by mere chance, certainly not intelligence or science, because there was no science that I knew of in those days, nearly 40 years ago, tumors that we could observe visibly on people when they would consume lots of fruit, which we provided, by the way. They were the good old days. When you came to Epocrates and we were giving you organic fruit until you got sick of organic fruit, would start to grow. And this was completely contrary to what the standard belief then, and seemingly for a lot of people who don't read modern science, believe today. That fruit is wonderful and has antioxidants. As a matter of fact, two of my colleagues and good friends at Tufts University were part of the research that showed you how great fruit was. And it is. It has antioxidants that are amazing. I mean, you get a berry. I've often purchased blueberries, because I eat a little bit of fruit, so we'll get to that in a minute, and put it in my refrigerator, gone away for a month, come back, and they're there. They have such great antioxidants in it. So all of that is in fact true. But then we started to look at the cancer. So we wiped it out initially at Epocrates for cancer. Within a matter of a year to 2 years, we said, well, wait a minute. How about viruses? And Anna Marie was an expert on microscopes for about a quarter of a century. So we started to put fruit sugar that we actually created out of the fruit. It wasn't we bought it or it was fructose. Or we put it on the petri dish. We put a virus, a bacteria there, whatever it may be, a mold, a yeast, a fungus. And these things, they look like fire. They took off. So we instantly understood that that was implemented, needed to be implemented. So we pretty much took this very strong stance, not because we think fruit is bad, but we think in the case of disease, fruit is bad. When the Institute resided, we initiated in 1956 in Boston. Anna Maria moved the Institute in 1987 down to Florida. But in Boston, we lost a brain trust when we moved, because many of the professors and doctors and scientists would sneak over to Epocrates and say, don't tell anyone we're here. But they wanted to help us. Because some of these doctors, in fact, sent patients out and said, you're going to die, and the patient would show up a year or 5 years later and say, look, I'm well, because I ate bean sprouts, And the doctor said, what are you talking about? And so they were helping us do science. So that's where we came up with the number 15%. And this is well before we have solid data now that we can quote on this. But the fact is that when you get above 15%, even in Anna's, Brenda's, or my body, you start to have exceptionally high amounts of sugar that then can become opportunistic. Not be the sugar that feeds a cell for energy, but exceptional sugar that's in the bloodstream. And sugar that's in the bloodstream, there's a term for that called blood sugar. And of course, we have a disease called blood sugar, but I will also show you that it can feed viruses and mold and yeast and fungus and bacteria. Now, when we started to talk about this, I'd go out to alternative medical conferences. They almost booed me off the stage because there was no empirical evidence. There was no evidence of this at all. I happen to be, this is how nature works sometimes. I'm on a plane flying to Los Angeles to lecture. And here in America, if you're not in America, how we evaluate one another instantly is we ask each other what we do. Anna Marie couldn't figure this out. She said, why do they ask me what we do? So I said, keep telling them you're a garbage collector. They'll leave. So the guy sitting next to me said, what do you do? And I mumbled, because I was reading, and I mumbled, I direct an alternative health center in Boston. He said, is it Epocrates? Oh my God, my aunt went to Epocrates, and blah, blah, blah. And to be polite, I said, what do you do? He said, I'm an agricultural scientist in fruit cultivation at the University of California. That was the end of that trip for him. All at once, I realized that in biological human science, there was nothing written. As a matter of fact, fruit, which I think was the original diet of man, there's no question in my mind, as I showed you the teeth yesterday in my presentation, it was the original diet of man. It's a perfect food. Perfect food. He led me to a whole body of evidential science and agricultural science I knew nothing about. And seemingly nobody seems to read this, except the eggheads in agricultural science. And he told me, the average fruit today is 30 times sweeter than the original fruit. And to make a point for the listeners out there, he said, do you like crab apples? I said, oh, no, crab apples are too sour. He said, oh, that's a hybrid. He said, the original apple was more sour. I said, you're kidding me. And then he asked, what's your favorite apple? I said, Red Delicious. Why? I'm like you. I like the sweetest. He said, what's your favorite? He said, that's 50 times, 50 times. And he said, what's your favorite orange? I said, well, that's a Honeybell. He said, so that was recently created. That they actually took a tangerine and spliced it with a grapefruit. And who doesn't like a Honeybell? It's very sweet. So the point I'm making is that over 80% of the fruit we consume today at the beginning of the 21st century didn't exist 100 years ago. It's completely fabricated by man. That the average fruit has 30 times more sugar. And then the other bummer is that we destroyed the pancreas in our body because hardly anyone ate processed sugar 100 years ago. Unless you were part of the aristocracy, and this group certainly doesn't look like it, unless a king and queen's listening to us somewhere in the world, you certainly don't look like the aristocracy. They ate sugar, and you know how much they ate? About a kilo a year. A kilo a year. So they bring it out like on Christmas or Hanukkah or Easter, and they take morsels and they lock it up. They had a piece of furniture they locked it up in their dining room. I mean, my God. What's ironic is governments came in and started to subsidize the sugar cartel. And it is a cartel. If you want to read an interesting expose on how evil these people are, the New York Times just recently published a large, elaborate, great story, investigative story on this. Everything's involved, like the drug cartel in this. And what we ended up finding out after all of this, and then now employing it for nearly 40 years, is that we by mistake became right. So now Stanford agrees with us, and University of California. And my favorite guy in the world on cancer, which I always focus on, because if cancer can be corrected, and if cancer can be prevented, all the other things are easy. I can tell you right now. Most holistic doctors like to work with diabetes type 2. If you don't get well from diabetic type 2 conditions, you're not doing anything right. Heart attacks, everyone gets well from heart attacks because no such disease as a heart attack or diabetic type 2. That's lifestyle choices. But when it comes to cancer, everyone's afraid and they want to keep their hands off it. I've watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people with catastrophic cancer reverse it. And since we stopped the sugar 40 years ago, much higher incidence of people bringing about their own recovery. So to me, it's not a theory, it's not a philosophy. It's not that, yes, we have everyone dancing and the research shows such a thing. It is proof. It's a human proof. And I'm going to tell you, I loved meat the day I gave meat up, but I gave it up in a day. I love dairy. That took me 3 years. It took me 35 years to give up sugar. I just renamed my sugar. White sugar was bad. So I said, I don't eat sugar because it was white sugar. Then it went to honey. Then it went to maple syrup. Thank God I got off the train before agave syrup. The worst sugar of all. The worst sugar of all is agave. It's 90% fruit sugar. And look at Thomas Seyfried, my favorite of all. Thomas Seyfried, who wrote the definitive book in history on cancer. He basically, when he came to the Institute for our major scientific conference, sat with me for 3 hours on napkins and showed me what he learned about fruit sugar. Fruit sugar feeds cancer and other diseases more than any other form of sugar. Period. Why? Because it's the only sugar that metabolizes like fat in the body. All sugars make us fat, but they don't metabolize like fat. How much fruit should you eat? Do I think fruit's bad? No, I don't think fruit's bad. I mean, my God, I used to eat, fast food, pizza pie, and soda. So compare that to a blueberry. Hey, I'll take a blueberry hands down any day. But the truth of the matter is, limit the amount of fruit you have when you're in the conquest of fighting a disease. Eliminate fruit for a period of time until you get better. But fruit is, unfortunately, been tampered with. It is not the fruit of your great-great-grandparents. It's just not there.
And I'll just say a few things about that. But I respect very much your experience, and it would be wonderful if you could write that up.
I know.
Hold on 1 second.
Did that not?
We didn't hear
Okay.
it.
So I just wanted to respond in a few ways. First is that I very much respect the experience that you've had. I would be very grateful if some of these experiences could be written up and peer-reviewed and get into the literature, because I'll tell you today, after you said what you said about fruit, I went upstairs and went on PubMed and put fruit and cancer into PubMed. The first 10 studies that came up all showed very significant risk reduction with fruit consumption. There was only one that didn't. And you know why it didn't? They were looking at the amount of canned fruit people were eating. And of course, canned fruit, there may be some issues, like a lot of even added sugar. But all of the other, every study I looked at, one after the other, some were looking at fruits and vegetables, but they were separating them.
Yes.
So they actually had a % risk reduction for vegetables, which was usually higher than it was for fruit. Fruit was a little bit less, but very consistently showed both fruit and vegetable intake. And maybe it's because people who eat fruit are having fruit instead of ice cream.
Instead of meat, instead of
other things.
It's like oatmeal. When people give up bacon and they lose 2 points in cholesterol, it's because they're not eating eggs that day. Yeah.
So that may be part of it, but of course, many of the theories are because of the phytochemicals and antioxidants and fiber, and of course a lot of people are growing their own food as well. And so I go in the woods and collect elderberries, for example, and make a little mix. Oregon grapes grow in our yard, so Oregon grape and elderberry mixture to put on, in our little breakfast bowls. And so we do that kind of thing, and I think the wild elderberries would be a really good choice. But, Michael Greger grew elderberries in his yard this year, and he was so proud of himself. Did everybody hear this story? He took a couple of cups and put them in his smoothie, and a few minutes later he was drooling over his computer and realized he had poisoned himself, and he was picturing his tombstone, how not to die. Anyway, he was telling me this story. I was splitting my gut laughing. But anyway, I said, Michael, I did the exact same thing, except I was smart enough to cook them before we ate them.
Exactly.
Because black elderberries are poisonous. Yeah. Anyway, that's the funny for tonight. But yeah, so I think we still have a lot to learn, obviously, and I include a fair bit of fruit, and I know, Cyrus and Robbie that are doing the Mastering Diabetes with a raw food diet. Exactly. They're very fruit heavy and having tremendous success with people with diabetes. So we're still, we're in our infant stage here, understanding food and nutrition, and so all of these experiences are very valuable, and we can learn from one another.
Go ahead.
And so the Institute is a living laboratory. This is not laboratory with mice or anything. This is living laboratory for 62 years, seeing what happens to people. And the last 32 years, that's when we got stricter with fruit, because you learn you have to live in the time you're in. So whatever worked 60 years ago, it doesn't work today. We've had to change a lot of things on our program. You have to live in the time you're in when you're working with people's health. This is the most precious thing that we can work with. And, so we see, and people see, and they say, I thought I had to have fruit because it's so much written about it and so much good stuff. And then I realized I don't need it, and I'm doing better, and actually I feel more balanced. Because we're all saturated with sugar already. We're living in a generation, we've had so much more sugar, like Brian said, than any generations. It is in so many things, because they took fat out of all the processed food. So we didn't get fat, because in the 70s people were screaming about it. And then they put sugar in instead. And so we've all are sugar addicts. Brian and I joke about it and said, you're either recovering or you are a sugar addict.
Yeah.
So
I'm a sugar addict. I'm just a recovering sugar addict.
We're recovering sugar addicts.
That's it.
And so fruit will come back. And of course, every guest that comes through our program that now is fighting cancer, and we'll tell them probably in 2 years, you'll have it back, but no more than 15%. And you will enjoy it so much more when you get it back, and you will only eat organic fruit, because any other fruit is so heavy sprayed that you shouldn't even come near it.
Let me just, before we finish this is an important subject, maybe one of the most important questions, because rather than debate this, we're giving you a little bit of a window into science. So I've written a book called Sweet Disease that I reference study after study. I didn't get on PubMed. They sort of, the convenient ones come up, or whatever moves to the top of the computer comes up. But everything I ever write is backed with solid science. And unlike others, not just solid science, but my experience. So I either apply a theory and then see science that will back it, or I find science and change my attitude and then employ it. So in Sweet Disease, each chapter is a different disease, and I give you the science of how sugar feeds that particular disease. And the other thing is Dr. Steer, so we got confused, who I used to debate on NBC, CBS, and ABC in Boston. He was paid off by the sugar industry and dairy industry. He was a Harvard nutritionist. And they would sit us there, and they know I was young, and I'd scream and yell, and it was always great TV. And I wish I was much smarter in those days. But the reality is Dr. Steer gave us a lot of the misinformation that's called mainstream science today on sugars. The different kinds of sugars, how sugars react in the body, as he did with fats, monounsaturated, etc. He was sort of the guy that set up a lot of this misinformation that we've maintained in science today. And it was a broken theory to begin with. And I think we have to relook at this entire thing. If you look at Seyfried, who used to be Yale, you know Seyfried, Thomas Seyfried, who wrote the book, he's at the top of the game. And by the way, he's the one that basically said, Brian, it's great you don't give fruit here. Why does it feed cancer? I said, well, because it does this. He said, no, you're wrong. And he sat me down for 3.5 hours at the Institute in Wigmore Hall and showed me on papers what he learned in decade after decade of doing it. And he was the one that actually explained to me that it's a Warburg theory of why fruit creates cancer. Warburg goes back to research from 1920 to 1924, published it, and got the Nobel Prize in the 1930s for it. And he said, all you have to do is reduce oxygen by 1/3. Every healthy person here, if we reduced our oxygen by 1/3, you start to actually create cancer cells in the body, with no exception. Now, if you're weak, lots of cancer cells. And if you metabolize fruit sugar as fat, guess what you're doing? You're reducing oxygen. If you already have cancer and you reduce oxygen, do you think that may help to metastasize the cancer? Or spread the virus? And so I do think so. So, and again, what Anna said I think is most pertinent to this conversation. You don't know how many people were on fruit diets and have come to us. Thousands. as I was. My diet was 60% fruit at one point. And I felt great because it wasn't hamburgers, and it wasn't steak, and it wasn't pizza pie, and it wasn't all of the garbage I ate. But I'm going to tell you, if I compare how strong, muscular, mentally, physically I am today compared on greens, which gorillas eat, by the way. Gorillas do not eat fruit. Versus monkeys running around like this, eating, it's night and day, man. It's night and day. It's night and day. And why gorillas happen to be the strongest creature on earth, they don't eat fruit. They happen to eat greens. And by the way, they eat sprouts in nature. They'll actually pick the root up, clean the root, and eat the sprout. Instinctually, they know that that's the strongest part.
So just because this is a topic that keeps getting brought up over and over and again, and it would be good to really clarify it, what about, Brenda, what Brenda's saying, that there's study after study saying fruits are good, and you have the extreme where Doug Graham is saying, I've healed tons of people on an all-fruit diet, on the 80-10-10 diet, and then you have people who are saying, just you don't have to be that extreme, but just moderate amounts, it fits into the diet. So again, is it, are you taking too strong a position on fruit, or are you
No.
really feeling like this is really
There always has to be somebody that is at the head of the arrow, and that's where I think we are at this point. When I was a macrobiotic, and such a good macrobiotic, I wrote one of Michio Kushi's books with him, I finally realized it wasn't what people were eating in the macrobiotic diet that was making them well. It's what they removed from their diet that made them well. And I think it's the same exact thing with heavy fruit consumption. If I compare my old American diet, Western diet, to when I was eating fruit, I felt remarkable on fruit. Because again, this is where it gets a little confusing for you. Fruit was the original diet of man. There's absolutely no question in my mind, or serious anthropologists' minds today. And if you didn't see it here in the room yesterday, review on The Real Truth About Health, the conference I gave where I showed actually the teeth of your ancestors and your teeth. And the intestinal, and you look closely, it shows all of the reasons we were frugivorous. So by removing bad things, by eating more raw food, it has enzymes, phytochemicals, loaded with, not nearly sprouts. Sprouts have a lot more without the sugar. But the reality is that's phytochemicals. Do you think Pepsi-Cola has phytochemicals? You think hamburgers have phytochemicals? No. So you're going to get the benefits of it. But again, if I took heroin, I could actually show you nutritional benefit of eating heroin. Yeah, there's always good and bad in everything. And I don't want to sound like this is going to discourage any of you from thinking, gee, I've been eating fruit, it's a great thing. God bless you. You've made a great step in the right direction. Congratulations. You're not eating donuts anymore. You're not eating, God knows, candy bars anymore. So that's good. But if you are fighting a disease, my message is loud and clear, not extreme, but experiential and scientifically validated today. Stop eating fruit temporarily. Now, what people forget in the process of recovery is someday you're trying to get better. And once you get better, then you can do things in moderate forms. By the way, Sheila's in one of the most beautiful places in North America, I can tell you. It's actually in Canada and it's warm. Isn't that an oxymoron? It's beautiful and warm. If I had elderberries in my backyard, if I had blueberries growing, which they do starting in May and up there, I'd be out there eating them too. And by the way, I eat some fruit now. I'm not suggesting I don't eat fruit. This is not a religion. This isn't fanaticism. I look at these things in practical ways. So please embrace moving forward, staying open, and learning what needs to be learned today. If you want to know more about it, I'm not trying to sell books. I'm trying to give you real science. That's not cherry-pick science or what's the hottest thing on the internet. Read my book, Sweet Disease. It will explain this in detail for you.